I was 47 when everything began to fall apart. I had worked at the same university for more than 20 years, teaching English literature to young students who often looked bored but listened just enough to pass. I thought I understood life, love, and human weakness. I had read all the great novels after all. But reading about weakness is not the same as living it. At that time, I still believed that desire was a kind of truth. I believed it made life beautiful and real. It started with one of my students. Her name does not matter now. She was 20, maybe 21, quiet, with the kind of beauty that seems unplanned. She came to my office one afternoon to ask about a poem. I remember how she stood by the window while I spoke. The sun was falling through the glass, and for a moment, the room felt too small. I should have seen what was happening inside me, but I didn't. I told myself it was admiration, not desire. I told myself I was too old to want her. Weeks passed. I began to wait for her visits. She laughed at my jokes in class, and when she smiled at me, something inside me woke up. I felt young again, and that was dangerous. I was divorced, living alone in a small apartment near the university. My life had become quiet, almost invisible. I thought this girl had brought light into it. I didn't see how wrong I was. One night after a lecture, I offered her a ride home. It was raining, and she accepted. When she said goodbye, I asked if she wanted to come in for a coffee. I don't know what I expected. Maybe nothing at all. But she followed me up the stairs, and in that moment, everything that should have stopped me disappeared. I remember her silence, the smell of wet clothes, the way my heart was beating too fast. What happened that night changed my life forever. Afterward, I tried to make sense of it. I told myself it was love. I thought I could protect her, teach her, make her part of my world. I didn't understand that I had crossed a line I could never return from. She stopped coming to class. When I sent her emails, she didn't answer. Then one day, the department called me for a meeting. There were papers on the table, formal words like complaint, harassment, and professional misconduct. I sat there, cold, listening to people I had known for years speak to me as if I were a stranger. The story spread quickly. Students whispered. Colleagues looked at me without speaking. I refused to admit guilt. I said it was a private matter between adults. I said it had nothing to do with the university, but the truth was heavier than my pride. I lost my position before the end of the term. They gave me the choice to resign or face a public hearing. I chose to resign. When I left the campus for the last time, I felt both angry and free. I told myself they were hypocrites, that they had no right to judge me. But deep inside, I felt a kind of emptiness I had never known. My phone stopped ringing. Friends became polite but distant. I thought of the girl sometimes, not with love, but with shame. I tried to write again, to prepare lectures for small community classes, but nothing worked. The words on the page looked thin and false. My daughter, Lucy, lived on a small farm 2 hours away, in the countryside. She had left the city years before. tired of its noise and rules. She grew vegetables, sold them at the market, and lived with her dogs. We were not close, but when she heard about what happened, she called me and said I could stay with her for a while. I packed my things and went. I told myself it was only temporary, that I would find a new job soon. I didn't understand that my old life was gone. The road to her farm was long and quiet. I remember the smell of dry grass and the sound of insects in the heat. When I arrived, Lucy came out of the house with her hair tied back and dirt on her hands. She looked strong and calm, the opposite of me. Her world was simple. She grew food, cared for her animals, and minded her own business. I envied her peace. At first, I tried to help her. I woke early, carried buckets of water, and fed the dogs. But I was clumsy. My hands were used to books, not soil. Still, she never complained. In the evenings, we sat outside and watched the light fade over the fields. Sometimes she spoke about her plans for the farm, about the people in the nearby village, about her small life. I listened and felt something like safety for the first time in months. But even in that quiet place, my disgrace followed me. The newspapers had written about my case, and sometimes strangers recognized my name. Lucy said it didn't matter, that people forgot quickly, but I could see how they looked at me when we went to town. I became careful, afraid of being seen. I stayed on the farm most days, reading old books and fixing fences. I told myself I was helping, that I was rebuilding something. But in truth, I was hiding. Then came the day that broke the last pieces of who I was. It was a Sunday morning, and Lucy had gone to the market. I was in the garden trying to repair a gate when I saw 3 young men walking down the dirt road. I didn't think much of it. They waved and smiled, and I waved back. When Lucy returned later, she said they had visited the farm before, that they were from a nearby settlement. She said they were friendly. I wanted to believe her. A week later, they came again. This time, Lucy was alone in the house. I was out in the field with the dogs when I heard her shouting. By the time I reached the house, it was too late. They had taken what they wanted. They left her broken, lying on the floor, and the house was burning. I managed to pull her out before the fire spread. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word. She only looked at me as if I had no right to stand there. In the days after, she refused to call the police. I begged her to report it, but she said no. She said she wanted to stay, to rebuild, to move on. I couldn't understand her silence. I thought she was protecting them, but later I realized she was protecting herself. She didn't want to be seen as a victim. I saw my own shame reflected in her eyes. She was carrying a pain that no one could fix, and I was powerless to help. I began to feel that everything in my life had been stripped away. My work, my reputation, my dignity, even my daughter's trust. I had once believed I understood human desire, that it was a sign of life and freedom. Now, it felt like a curse. The same hunger that had ruined my career had also brought us here, to this empty house on a quiet farm, where the silence at night felt heavier than guilt. Sometimes, When I lay awake, I thought of the girl from the university and how she must have felt after what I did. I thought of Lucy, who now moved through her days without speaking much. And I thought of myself, once a woman with power, now a shadow living in the ruins of her choices. That was the beginning of my real punishment. Losing my job was easy compared to living with the person I had become. Before I continue with the story, please like, subscribe, share, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Your support means a lot. Now, let's continue. After the attack, time lost its shape. Days passed, but I could not tell one from another. The farm seemed quieter than before, as if the world had decided to hold its breath. Lucy went back to her work almost immediately. She said nothing about what happened. She woke early, fed the dogs, and worked in the fields as if her body had not been broken. I watched her and wondered how she could stand it. I tried to stay near her, to help with small things, but she did not look at me often. Her silence was harder to bear than her pain. I wanted to take her away, to sell the farm and leave that place forever. But she said no. She said she would not let them drive her out. She said the land was her home. I could not argue with her. I had no right to decide for her. Still, every time I looked at the hills, I thought of the men who had come through our gate. I imagined them still out there somewhere. Walking free, I could not forgive that. I went to the police myself. They listened politely, took notes, and promised to investigate. But I saw in their faces that nothing would happen. In that part of the country, things like this were common, and people learned not to ask for justice. I returned home angry and useless. Lucy did not ask what I had done. She only said she did not want to talk about it. So I stayed silent too. At night, I lay awake and listened to the sounds of the farm. The dogs barked at shadows. The wind moved through the dry grass. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside the window, but when I looked, there was nothing. I felt like a prisoner waiting for a punishment that never came. The shame of my own past mixed with the shame of what happened to Lucy, and I could no longer tell them apart. One morning, she told me she was expecting a child. She spoke quietly, almost without emotion. For a moment, I did not understand what she meant. Then she said she would keep the baby. I was shocked. I asked her if she was sure, if she wanted that reminder in her life forever. She said she was sure. She said the child would be innocent, even if its beginning was not. I could not find words. I wanted to scream, to beg her to change her mind, but I saw that nothing I said would matter. In the weeks that followed, I watched her rebuild the house. The roof had been damaged in the fire, so we worked together to replace it. I learned how to hammer nails and carry wood. My hands became rough and red, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of real work. I began to understand why Lucy chose this life. It was hard, but it was also honest. There was no place for lies or excuses here. The land accepted you, or it didn't. There was no middle ground. I began to take care of the dogs. There were many of them, mostly strays she had rescued. They followed her everywhere. I fed them, cleaned their shelter, and sometimes sat with them when I could not sleep. They seemed to know something about pain. They did not ask questions. They only stayed near, breathing quietly, warm and alive. Sometimes people from the nearby village came to visit. They brought eggs, fruit, or vegetables, and Lucy would thank them and talk kindly. I stayed inside during those visits. I did not like the way they looked at me. Some of them recognized my name from the news. Others only saw an older woman who no longer belonged in their world. Once, I overheard someone ask Lucy if I was her mother. She said yes. The woman laughed softly and said, "She must have been beautiful once." I went back to my room and stayed there the rest of the day. In the evenings, I tried to write again. Not about love or desire this time, but about shame and survival. The words came slowly, sometimes painfully. I wrote about the girl from the university, though I did not use her name. I tried to understand myself through those sentences. I realized that I had always believed I could control the story of my life, but now I saw that life writes its own story, and we only follow along. Lucy never read what I wrote. I did not show her. She was living her own story now, one that was far more difficult and brave than mine. I admired her, even as I feared for her. I wanted to protect her, but she no longer needed my protection. One evening, she told me that one of the men from the attack had returned to speak to her. My chest tightened when I heard that. She said he wanted to work on the farm to help her rebuild. I told her it was madness. She said she could not live in fear forever. I begged her not to trust him. She said she was not trusting him, only surviving. I could not understand her calmness. I wanted revenge, justice, anything that would make the world make sense again. But she was beyond that. She said that to live here, we had to accept the rules of the land, not our own. I felt sick hearing her words, but I also saw her strength. I wondered if this was what forgiveness looked like, not peace, but quiet endurance. One afternoon, I went into town to buy supplies. It was a hot day, and I stopped at a small cafe for water. A man sitting at a nearby table recognized me. He looked at me for a long time, then said my name softly as if testing it. I pretended not to hear. I paid and left, but the shame stayed with me all the way home. I realized that my disgrace had not faded with time. It had simply changed shape. I was no longer a teacher who lost her job. I was a woman who carried her past like a wound that never healed. When I reached the farm, Lucy was in the garden, her belly beginning to show beneath her loose shirt. She looked peaceful, her hands covered in soil. I thought of how life continues no matter how broken it becomes. She saw me watching and smiled slightly. For the first time in months, I felt something close to hope. Later that night, I sat outside while the sky turned dark. I listened to the insects and the wind. The dogs were lying nearby, half asleep. I thought about desire and how it had brought me here. It had begun as a small flame, something that made me feel alive. but I had followed it without understanding its cost. I had hurt others, and I had lost myself. Now I was learning that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. Still, there was something in the quiet of the farm that gave me peace. The work, the soil, the rhythm of each day, even the silence between Lucy and me. It was not happiness, but it was real. I began to understand that living with shame did not mean being destroyed by it. It meant continuing anyway, one day after another. Sometimes I imagined what people in the city might think of me now. Maybe they forgot me. Maybe they still used my story as a warning. It did not matter. I no longer needed their approval. I was no longer part of that world. My world was smaller now, harder, but also cleaner. When I looked at the sunrise over the hills, I felt that maybe this was the life I was meant to have all along. Not teaching books, but learning how to survive. At night, when I could not sleep, I thought about forgiveness. I did not know if I believed in it anymore. I had not forgiven myself, and Lucy had not forgiven me. But perhaps forgiveness was not something that happened all at once. Perhaps it was a slow process, like the way new grass grows after a fire. You do not see it at first. Then one day, there it is. I began to think that maybe one day Lucy's child would grow up on this land, among the dogs and the trees, and never know what had happened here. Maybe that would be a kind of forgiveness too. And in that thought, for the first time, I felt the smallest sense of peace. By the time the baby was born, the seasons had changed. The summer heat had softened, and the wind carried the smell of new rain. Lucy gave birth in the small clinic in town. I sat beside her the whole time, though she did not ask me to. She was quiet and strong, her face calm even when the pain came. When the baby cried for the first time, something inside me broke open. I had thought I could not feel joy again, but I did. It was a quiet joy, mixed with fear and sadness, but it was real. The child was small and beautiful. Lucy named him Samuel. She did not say why she chose the name. I did not ask. She looked at him with a kind of tired love that I did not understand. I wondered if she saw the men who hurt her when she looked at the child. But she said only that he was hers, and that was enough. We brought Samuel home wrapped in a soft blanket. The dogs followed us around, curious and excited. Lucy moved slowly for the first few days. I cooked and cleaned, and for once she let me help without protest. In the evenings, I held the baby while she slept. His breathing was soft and steady, like the sound of forgiveness. I began to believe that perhaps life gives us small chances to start again, even when we do not deserve them. The farm changed after that. The house felt alive again. People from the village came to visit, bringing small gifts for the baby. They smiled more now when they spoke to Lucy. They treated her with respect. I noticed that some of them even spoke kindly to me. Perhaps they had decided that enough time had passed. Or perhaps the sight of new life made them forget what they had once heard. I stayed on the farm longer than I planned. I told myself it was because Lucy needed help, but the truth was simpler. I had nowhere else to go. The university never called. No other schools wanted to hire me. My name was still a warning in academic circles. At first I thought I would feel trapped, but the longer I stayed, the more I accepted it. The city no longer felt like home to me. I began to understand that this quiet place, with its rough soil and hard mornings, was where I belonged now. Every week I went into town for supplies. The shopkeepers knew me by name, and they treated me kindly. I noticed that when people spoke to me, they no longer mentioned the past. They spoke about weather, prices, animals, and crops. Small things that made up daily life. It felt safe. I started to take care of an old man's animals in the nearby valley. His name was Peter, and he could no longer walk well. He had heard about me from Lucy. He needed help feeding his dogs and goats. I went every few days. His farm was smaller than ours and quiet. The animals trusted me quickly. I cleaned their pens, fixed their fences, and sometimes sat outside with them in the afternoon sun. I liked the simple work. It made me feel useful again. Sometimes Peter talked about the years before. He said that the world had changed too fast. He said people no longer knew how to live close to the land. I listened but did not answer. I knew that he was speaking about more than the land. He was speaking about how people lose their sense of balance when they think they can control everything. I understood that better than anyone. When I came home each evening, Lucy was usually in the garden with Samuel. She would smile when she saw me, a small smile that meant peace rather than love. That was enough. We no longer spoke about the past. It sat between us like an old wound that had closed but still ached in bad weather. We had learned to live around it. Months turned into a year. Samuel began to walk. He followed the dogs everywhere, laughing when they barked. He liked to sit on my lap and listen to the stories I told. I did not tell him stories from books. I told him stories about the earth, about rain and wind, about small things that grow even after fire. He listened carefully, his eyes wide and serious. Sometimes I wondered if he could feel the history that surrounded him, even though he could not yet understand it. Lucy became softer with time. She still worked hard, but there was a lightness in her that I had not seen before. I think Samuel gave her that. Watching her with him, I saw something that looked like forgiveness. Not the kind that comes from words or religion, but the quiet kind that grows from surviving. One afternoon, while I was repairing a fence, a car stopped near the gate. A man stepped out. He wore a suit that looked too formal for the countryside. He introduced himself as a journalist from Cape Town. He said he wanted to speak to me about the university. My stomach tightened. I thought all of that was behind me. I told him there was nothing to say. He smiled politely and said that people were interested in how I had rebuilt my life. I told him they should not be. I asked him to leave. He looked disappointed but respectful. As he drove away, I felt a strange relief. For the first time, I did not feel fear. I felt control. The story of my disgrace no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. That night, I sat outside again and thought about how far I had come. I was not proud, but I was no longer destroyed either. I had stopped trying to explain myself to the world. I understood now that forgiveness does not always come from others. Sometimes it comes from the work of living honestly after the fall. I thought about desire again, the thing that had begun everything. I used to think desire was freedom. Then I learned it could be a trap. Now I saw that it was neither good nor bad. It was simply human. What matters is what we do with it and how we live after the choices we make. Lucy came out quietly and stood next to me. Samuel was asleep inside. She said that she was thinking about expanding the farm, maybe planting more vegetables for the market. I told her it was a good idea. She asked if I wanted to stay another year. I said yes without hesitation. There was nothing left for me elsewhere. She nodded and went back inside. That small exchange meant more to me than any apology or promise. It meant belonging. When the night grew colder, I stayed outside and watched the stars. I thought about my students from long ago. I wondered where they were now, what they remembered of me. I hoped that at least one of them had learned something from my mistakes, even if I never meant to teach that lesson. Sometimes, when I looked at the hills in the morning light, I imagined I could see my old self walking there, the woman who believed she understood everything. I did not hate her anymore. I felt sorry for her. She had chased something she thought was love and lost her way. But she was still part of me, and I could not live without her. I began to help Lucy with her market trips again. I liked standing behind the wooden table, arranging the vegetables and watching people talk. Some recognized me but said nothing. Others smiled kindly. Nobody asked about my past. In those small moments, I felt a strange kind of healing. When I returned to the farm in the afternoons, I sat under the old tree near the gate. Samuel often ran to me with a flower in his hand. He would put it in my hair and laugh. Each time he did, I thought of how life continues in spite of everything. Pain does not disappear, but it becomes part of the story. One evening, as the sun went down, I realized I was no longer waiting for forgiveness. I was already living it, in the work, the silence, the small acts of care. I had once thought disgrace was the end, but it was only the beginning of understanding what it means to live without pretending. That was the real price of desire, not the loss of work or respect or reputation, but the slow learning of humility, the knowledge that love and shame often walk side by side. When I went to bed that night, I listened to the sound of the baby breathing in the next room, to Lucy moving softly in her sleep, to the dogs resting by the door. The world was quiet, and for the first time in many years, I felt at peace with it. I had finally accepted that forgiveness was not something to ask for, it was something to live. If you liked my story, please like, comment, and share.